Zena pulled her worn-out jacket closer as she walked through the empty streets of Pine Valley. The small town was quiet at 6 a.m., just how she liked it. Every morning, she took this route to deliver newspapers before school. It wasn't much, but the money helped her mom with the bills. As she turned onto Maple Road, something caught her eye. Near Mrs. Cooper's garden, behind the rose bushes, she spotted a flash of orange. At first, she thought it was just the morning light playing tricks, but then she heard a soft whimper. Zena moved closer, her newspaper bag sliding off her shoulder. There, curled up under the bushes, was a fox. Its leg was caught in what looked like an old trap, and dried blood matted its fur. The fox's eyes met hers. They weren't filled with fear, but with pain. "Hey there," Zena whispered, keeping her distance. "You're hurt pretty bad, aren't you?" The fox tried to move away but couldn't. Zena knew she had to help, but she also knew wild animals could be dangerous. Her Aunt Rory worked at the town's animal shelter. She would know what to do. But the shelter didn't open until 9, and Zena couldn't leave the fox like this. She pulled out her phone and called her mom. "Mom, I found an injured fox. I can't just leave it here." "Where are you?" Her mom's voice was thick with sleep. "Stay away from it, Zena. Wild animals dash. It's trapped, Mom. Its leg is bleeding. Please, can you call Aunt Rory?" 5 minutes later, her mom called back. Aunt Rory was coming, but it would take her 20 minutes to get there. Zena sat on the sidewalk, keeping watch. The fox's eyes never left her. "I'm going to stay right here," she told it. "Help is coming." As she waited, the sky turned from gray to pink. The fox's breathing was shallow, but it stayed still, as if it understood she wasn't a threat. Zena talked to it softly, telling it about school, about her dad who left when she was 6, about her dream of becoming a vet. When Aunt Rory arrived with her medical kit, the fox didn't try to bite or scratch. It let them approach carefully. "This is unusual," Aunt Rory said, checking the trap. "Foxes usually don't trust humans this easily." They managed to free the fox's leg. It had a deep cut, but Aunt Rory said with proper care, it would heal. "We'll take it to the shelter," she said, gently placing the fox in a carrier. "You should get to school, Zena." "Can I visit?" Zen asked. "After school?" Aunt Rory smiled. "Of course. But remember, it's a wild animal. Once it heals, we'll have to release it." That afternoon, Zena rushed to the shelter. The fox was in a quiet corner, its leg bandaged. When it saw her, its ears perked up. Aunt Rory was amazed. "It remembers you," she said. Day after day, Zena visited. She named the fox Rusty because of its reddish-orange fur. She did her homework sitting near its cage, talking about her day. Rusty would lie close to the bars, listening. Sometimes, Zena brought small treats that Aunt Rory approved. Weeks passed and Rusty's leg healed. Zena knew the day was coming when they'd have to let Rusty go, but she wasn't ready. The fox had become her friend, her secret keeper. One evening, as she sat by the cage, Rusty nudged her hand through the bars. Aunt Rory watched from the doorway. "You know," she said, "sometimes animals choose us as much as we choose them. But the kindest love knows when to let go." Zena nodded, tears in her eyes. "When will we release Rusty?" "Tomorrow morning, before the shelter opens. There's a quiet spot in the woods where foxes live. It would be perfect." That night, Zena barely slept. She thought about all the mornings she'd spent at the shelter, all the stories she'd shared with Rusty. When her alarm rang at 5 a.m., she was already dressed. The morning was cool and misty as they drove to the woods. Rusty was calm in the carrier, occasionally making soft sounds. They walked deep into the forest, where the trees grew thick and the undergrowth was dense. Aunt Rory said it was a good place for a fox, plenty of food and shelter. When they opened the carrier, Rusty didn't run right away. The fox stepped out slowly, sniffing the air. Then it turned to look at Zena, its amber eyes holding hers just like that first morning behind the rose bushes. "Go on," Zena said softly, her throat tight. "This is your home." Rusty took a few steps forward, then stopped. The fox turned back one more time, as if saying goodbye, before disappearing into the bushes. Zena stood there for a long while, watching the spot where Rusty had vanished. "Come on," Aunt Rory said gently. "You'll be late for school." The next few days felt empty. Zena still visited the shelter, helping Aunt Rory with other animals, but it wasn't the same. She missed seeing Rusty's face, missed having someone who just listened. A week after releasing Rusty, Zena was back on her paper route. The morning was foggy, and the streets were quiet as usual. As she passed Mrs. Cooper's garden, she paused, remembering the morning she'd found Rusty. The roses were blooming now, filling the air with their sweet smell. Then she heard it, a familiar sound. Behind the garden, in the shadows, stood Rusty. The fox looked healthy, its fur shining. Before Zena could move, she noticed something else. Behind Rusty were 3 small fox cubs, their fur a darker red than their mother's. "You have babies," Zena whispered in surprise. That's why Rusty had been so desperate that morning, trying to free herself from the trap. She had cubs to take care of. Rusty moved closer, the cubs staying hidden in the bushes. She stopped a few feet from Zena, tail swishing gently. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Rusty turned and disappeared with her cubs into the morning fog. After that, Zena often saw signs of Rusty during her morning route. Sometimes it was just paw prints in the mud, other times a quick glimpse of orange fur. The fox never came too close, but Zena knew she was watching, keeping her company in her own way. One morning, 3 months after releasing Rusty, Zena was walking her route when she heard angry shouting. Up ahead, near the edge of town, a man was yelling at his dog. The dog, a large German shepherd, was barking at something in the bushes. As Zena got closer, she saw what had gotten the dog so excited. One of Rusty's cubs had wandered too close to town. The small fox was frozen with fear as the dog strained against its leash. "Stop yelling at him," Zena called to the man. "You're making it worse." The man turned to her, his face red with anger. "This fox has been stealing from my chicken coop. I'm going to teach it a lesson." He unclipped the dog's leash. The German shepherd lunged forward. Zena's heart stopped. The fox cub was too scared to move. But before the dog could reach it, a flash of orange shot out from the bushes. Rusty stood between her cub and the dog, her teeth bared. The dog skidded to a stop, surprised by Rusty's sudden appearance. The fox didn't back down. She stood her ground, giving her cub time to run back into the safety of the bushes. "Call your dog," Zena shouted at the man. "Please." But it was too late. The dog recovered from its surprise and attacked. Rusty was quick, dodging the first bite, but the dog was bigger and stronger. They rolled in the dirt, a blur of fur and teeth. Zena dropped her newspaper bag and ran toward them, not knowing what she could do but knowing she had to help. The man just stood there, watching. Suddenly, another fox darted out of the bushes, bigger than Rusty, with darker fur. It was a male fox, probably the cub's father. He joined the fight, biting at the dog's back legs. The dog yelped in pain and backed away. The man finally moved, calling his dog. The German shepherd retreated to its owner, limping slightly. "If I see those foxes again," the man threatened, "I won't just let my dog chase them away." "They're protected animals," Zena said, her voice shaking with anger. "If anything happens to them, I'll tell the rangers it was you." The man glared at her but said nothing. He clipped the leash back on his dog and walked away. Rusty and the male fox melted back into the bushes. Zena could hear soft yipping sounds, the cubs checking on their parents. She wanted to go see if Rusty was hurt, but she knew better. This was their world, and they knew how to take care of themselves. That evening, Zena told Aunt Rory about what happened. "Foxes usually stay away from people," Aunt Rory said. "That man must have been leaving his chicken coop open. It's not the fox's fault, they're just trying to feed their family." "Can't we do something?" Zena asked. "What if he hurts them?" Aunt Rory thought for a moment. "I know the rangers. I'll talk to them about patrolling that area more often. And maybe we can talk to the man about better ways to protect his chickens without harming the foxes." The next day, Zena walked her paper route more slowly, keeping an eye out for any sign of Rusty or her family. Near Mrs. Cooper's garden, she found fresh paw prints. They led toward the woods at the edge of town. Days passed. Zena didn't see Rusty or her cubs, but she kept finding signs: a tuft of orange fur on a bush, small footprints in the mud, the remains of a rabbit meal. The angry man's chickens were left alone after Aunt Rory helped him build a better coop. One morning, about a month after the fight with the dog, Zena was walking through a quiet part of her route when she heard a strange noise. It wasn't coming from the bushes this time, but from above. Looking up, she saw a young eagle tangled in some power lines. The bird was struggling, its wing caught in the wires. Zena called Aunt Rory right away. "Don't try to help it yourself," Aunt Rory warned. "I'll call the power company and the wildlife rescue." As Zena waited, she noticed movement in the nearby bushes. Rusty appeared, followed by her cubs. They were bigger now, almost as big as their mother. The foxes sat in the shadow of a tree, watching the eagle. More animals gathered, a family of raccoons, some squirrels, even a few deer at the edge of the woods. It was like they all knew the eagle needed help and were waiting to make sure it would be okay. The power company arrived first, then the wildlife rescue team. They carefully freed the eagle and took it away for treatment. As the trucks drove off, the animals began to disappear back into the woods. Rusty and her cubs were the last to leave. That's when Xena understood something. The woods and the town weren't two separate worlds, they were connected. Every animal, from the smallest squirrel to the biggest deer, was part of this place. And sometimes, like Rusty had shown her, animals and humans could help each other. Summer turned to fall. The cubs grew into young foxes, learning to hunt on their own. Xena still saw them sometimes during her morning route, usually at a distance. Rusty would appear more often, especially on cold mornings, following Xena's route from the safety of the shadows. One year after Xena had found Rusty trapped in Mrs. Cooper's garden, she was walking her route when she saw something that made her smile. Near the spot where she'd first found Rusty, a new fox was curled up. It was one of Rusty's cubs, now grown up. And next to it were 3 tiny cubs of its own. Rusty sat nearby, watching her grandcubs play. When she saw Xena, she made a soft sound, almost like a greeting. The young fox looked up too, but showed no fear. It seemed to know that Xena was a friend. That evening, as Xena helped at the shelter, Aunt Rory noticed her smiling. "Good day?" she asked. "The best," Xena replied. "You know how you said sometimes animals choose us? I think sometimes they also teach us about trust, about caring, about letting go but not forgetting." Aunt Rory nodded. "That's why we do what we do. Every animal has a story, and sometimes we're lucky enough to be part of it." As Xena walked home that night, she heard a distant fox call. She knew Rusty was out there somewhere, teaching her grandcubs the ways of the forest, just as she had taught Xena about the connection between all living things. Some people said wild animals couldn't be friends with humans, but Xena knew better. Sometimes the best friendships were the quiet ones, built on trust and respect, watching over each other from a distance. And every morning as she walked her paper route, Xena kept an eye out for flashes of orange fur in the shadows, knowing that her friend was still there, a silent guardian in the early morning light.